Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 20. As you may have gathered by now, we're a big fan of dogs in this family. So we decided that for this 20th episode, we would sort of focus on all things dogs. We also thought this might be a good time to sort of formally introduce the Sapolsky dogs. So Sophie, our golden retriever, who obviously has made quite a few cameos already. And then this is Kupenda. He is our very wise Havanese, and he's a little bit more camera shy, but we have him with us here today, and we love them.
Yes,
we love them very much. So a few moons ago at this point, we made a reference to Williams syndrome in dogs. So we're just kind of going to start by revisiting that and just sort of get going first into what is Williams syndrome about.
Well, at long last, Williams syndrome is incredibly interesting. It's a neurodevelopmental genetic disorder. It's the rare disease where there's a deletion of a whole bunch of genes, one branch of one of the chromosomes. It's like 20, 30 genes or so that get deleted. And you get a very interesting, as they say in the business, a phenotype. Very interesting what that turns out to look like in the individual. First thing, all sorts of medical problems in people with Williams because of missing those genes, cardiac problems. Next thing, interesting stuff about the formation, the skull, the bones in the face, so that you get a very characteristic appearance of people, of kids with Williams, and it's always referred to as they look elfin. It's basically required that you say that they look elfin. You get kind of a pinched little face and little ears, and your prototypical person with Williams has a particular shape to their head and face. What's most interesting, though, is what's going on in the brain. There's cognitive impairment, and I think across all sort of Williams subjects, there's an average IQ of about 70 or so. So there's problems with that. But then stuff starts to get really interesting, which is for the same degree of cognitive impairment, people with Williams have incredibly advanced verbal skills, very articulate, very talkative, very complex vocabulary, things of that sort. And they're famous for this. Their grammatical constructs are not particularly fancy, but for somebody with a particular IQ, you ask them to name off how many of these that you could think of. Incredible verbal fluency when it comes to vocabulary. And as we'll see, probably not by chance, they've got this specialty of incredibly obscure terms for animals. You ask like your basic 7-year-old, tell me the names of some animals, and they'll say cat and dog and elephant and lion or whatever. And you ask a kid with Williams and they'll say like oryx and capybara and garniole or tardigrade and they just totally obscure stuff. So the first thing is this weird separation, dissociation of facility with vocabulary, and they're very, very talkative, with other aspects of cognition. This whole theme in the field that you have different modules of cognition, and amid a lot of modular impairment in individuals with Williams, this realm of linguistic facility is somehow spared there. And a remarkable flip side, there was a case report a while back of somebody who, looking at the stretch of DNA that's deleted in Williams, this was a first-time observed case of somebody where instead that stretch of DNA was duplicated a second time. And that person had extreme problems with language generation. Somehow the mirror image, so something or other of the genes that are taken out in Williams, and you disinhibit this incredible sort of vocabulary facility with that, express it twice in this rare individual, you get just the opposite. Okay, so that's pretty strange. But then you get into other things, like the vocabulary that they're particularly good at is emotional. They're really emotionally expressive. They are way better than one would expect at being able to read emotions on people's faces. Then it turns out they have a fantastic facility with music. Like a crazy high percentage of people with Williams have perfect pitch. They're very attuned to the emotional aspects of music, and they're really good at it. And people have done some brain imaging stuff, and you see activation of as disproportionately expanded part of the auditory cortex when someone with Williams is listening to music as you get with a professional musician. So there's this weird expansion thing going on there with emotive vocabulary, emotive facial expressions, musical expressivity. And then you get the weirdest thing about people with Williams, which is they are indiscriminately affectionate. They're kind, they're empathic. You're incapable of getting them to be distrustful of something. Classic cliche, you get a 5-year-old with Williams and they just run up to strangers and embrace them around the legs. And by the time you get to people with Williams, adolescence, young adulthood, they are vulnerable as hell to being manipulated. But this weird hypersociality of this very affectionate, trusting type, and coupled with a highly advanced ability to have like emotional language production and comprehension, and this weird musical thing. So it's a totally fascinating syndrome going on there, where the most striking thing is this pathological hypersociality, hyperfriendliness.
All right, so that brings us to the question of what's the deal with Williams syndrome in dogs. So I went and I pulled some notes from a paper from college here. So both humans and dogs have this gene called GTF21, which stands for Generalized Transcription Factor 21, which sort of formally translates to nobody knows what the hell it does. Basically, it's just like one of those that it's a whole network of genes that it's regulating. But yeah, so when you delete the gene, you get part of what Williams syndrome is about, that hypersociality piece. And it turns out that like one of the key genetic events in the evolution of dogs was them having a less active version of GTF21 than you would find in wolves, sort of a milder version of the GTF21 deletion that you see in Williams syndrome. This is where you get the extreme sort of indiscriminate sociability of dogs. So kind of just one interesting distinction on the biological level between wolves and dogs.
Part of what made dogs dogs was becoming a little bit William-esque in terms of sociability.
Some more than others. Okay, so on a more general note, we've just had a few questions about kind of like the nature of the relationship between humans and dogs. You know, why did humans form such a close relationship with canines in particular? Or as Zach from Colorado put it, what has happened in the brains of dogs and the brains of humans over the last 15,000 years to the point where we love them as if they are our family and they return the love and affection?
Which is great that Zach phrases it as something bidirectional, because wolves evolved into them, and we evolved from pre-dog hominins into current ones. And it was a very coupled co-evolutionary process. Okay, dogs were the first species that humans domesticated 20,000, 30,000 years ago. There's endless debates as to where the first dogs appeared on Earth. And I think the sense these days is that independent emergence of dogs from different wolf populations throughout Eurasia. So what went into dogs becoming dogs? Well, they had to get domesticated. And a lot of work has gone into thinking about this process. And the original version is something mindlessly simple, like selective breeding. 30,000 years ago, some humans got it in their heads to capture a whole bunch of wolves, and the only ones who seemed friendly, they let reproduce, and then they did that and then, dogs. No, this was not artificial selection. Nor was it natural selection by best evidence of dogs being selected for their willingness to be proximal to humans. What you saw instead, almost certainly, was humans are messy. They're hunters. They leave all sorts of dead animal parts around and stuff. And the ones destined to become dogs from wolves are the ones who were willing to stick around on the periphery and get the scraps and stuff. Were they yearning to like lick the faces of the humans and be? No, this was just easy eating. And immediately there was selection for certain personality types. First off, these are low-ranking wolves, because high-ranking wolves are not off looking for like human leftovers. They're getting their own. Low-ranking wolves, and in most social species, low rank means anxious, vigilant, dumped upon. So these were the rare low-ranking ones who at the same time were very trusting and had a very high threshold for getting anxious and needing to get away from here. And that's kind of what started the process. And thus, in that framework, what you were getting was self-domestication by dogs, self-selection for who was willing to hang around these humans. And what's most interesting on top of that is not only were dogs self-domesticating, but they were domesticating humans as well. Because, like, it's 30,000 years ago, and you're not going to go up and just scratch the ears of some wolf kind of thing, or it's a very rare subset of humans who would do. And you're selecting for humans who have like high thresholds for anxiety and fear responses, and you've got this co-evolution together. And you see it in sort of the array of genetic changes that turn wolves into dogs, which is surprisingly few number of genes. But as we saw just now, some of it seemingly has to do with this transcription factor, this cluster of genes that it regulates, having something to do with sociality, but other things as well. Dogs eat breakfast cereal if you let them have it. Wolves do not. Dogs had to evolve all sorts of digestive enzymes for eating human food with lots of fat, with starch. Once you had dogs who were farm dogs, especially so, what was that about? There's a gene coding for an enzyme, amylase, that breaks down starch in us. And wolves occasionally have it, and doesn't. And dogs have extra copies and extra copies, and farm dog breeds got a whole bunch of extra copies for digesting starch. Okay, so you look at dogs then, and they also have evolved to have a fairly high threshold for a fight or flight. And translating that into genes, into biology, things like adrenaline, epinephrine, aficionados, catecholamines, there's less synthesis of sympathetic nervous system catecholamine. They're less skittish. So there was that transition. Then there was another transition genetically in dogs, and this one is great. Okay, we're going to have a reenactment here of the first dog in history who had this gene. Can I have another bowl of kibble?
No, sorry, you already ate.
Please?
Oh, you're so cute.
There we have it. Dogs, unlike wolves, have muscles here. They evolved genes for muscles here so they can do that with their faces and tilt them sideways. So that clearly evolved for manipulating the hell out of the species that they were domesticating. Humans. But then there's other stuff as well. A well-known fact when you domesticate animals is they wind up having smaller brains than the species they came from and not being as smart. And the term is that they've been basically selected to stay as babies. They are neotenized. They are babies, and a dog spends its entire life acting like a baby wolf, wanting to cuddle up as if somebody is mommy, wanting to play. Adult wolves don't play. Baby wolves play. Adult dogs do. This arrested developmental thing that happens in dogs as they turn from wolves into them, which is they remain as babies. And every domesticated animal has a smaller brain and less mature behavior and more neotenized facial features and behaviors and emotional makeup than the grandparent original version there. So domestication is like turning wild animals into babies. So dogs certainly show that. Probably the most interesting thing in terms of a genetic change in dogs was implicitly a genetic change in us as well, having to do with this hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is the best. It's the grooviest hormone on earth. Oxytocin makes humans nicer to each other. It actually doesn't, but that's another story. But oxytocin evolved 150 million years ago for mother-infant bonding and connecting with that. And then on the rare occasions when social species stumbled into monogamy, independently evolved, oxytocin got hijacked there for also forming pair bonds. And then it got generalized in humans into things like social trust and generosity and empathy and all sorts of this pro-social stuff. So that's a fairly recent thing in sort of primate evolution. But then 20,000 years ago or so, we took this 150 million year old neurotransmitter system and we and them evolved it for a whole additional purpose, which is when you are looking at your dog and your dog's eyes and they're looking back in yours and you are holding that there and you both arch your eyebrows and all, you both secrete oxytocin like a gopher rat or something 100 million years ago avoiding dinosaurs who wanted to be able to recognize its babies. Humans and dogs have co-evolved, have opportunized, have co-opted, have hijacked the oxytocin mother-infant bonding business for bonding between two different species. And that is just the coolest that they've done that. You inject a dog with oxytocin and your dog will stare in your eyes longer, which will make you secrete more oxytocin, which will make you stare in your dog, which will make them secrete. And before you know it, you just love each other and you're buying Halloween costumes for them. So this is kind of what the domestication and the genetics of it has been, turning wolves into dogs.
Yeah, and obviously a big part of that is this idea of mutual love, which to be fair is complicated enough when you're just talking about, humans with mutual love, and then you bring in dogs. There's all sorts of behaviors that also seem to suggest sort of some version of it, right? Like you see synchrony with dogs. Dogs will move when their humans do. They'll stand up or sit down at the same time or orient in the same direction. And what's kind of interesting is different breeds, like shepherding dogs, show a lot higher and faster movement synchrony than larger breeds like Great Danes or Mastiffs, who are sort of guard dogs, and they have sort of the least synchrony of movement, or like gaze following and tracking, even extending to things like theory of mind, awareness of what their human can see. Chimps are closest relatives. You don't see that with them, and you see it with dogs, which is really neat. So yeah, all sorts of like little day-to-day things that at least demonstrate that dogs have evolved to understand and connect with humans in a way that other species don't.
We have an interesting oxytocin dichotomy in the family in that Safi, mommy, is the one that Safi wants to snuggle up with and lean his head on her neck and stuff. I'm the one, I go to get a pen from the other side of the room, and Safi leaps up because we're going hunting right now, and he follows me, and we get the pen, and we come back, and we talk afterward about what an amazing hunt it was. But in both cases, yeah, they have evolved to be paying attention to some other species. We've evolved for this very, very symbiotic relationship.
There's also a little note here about dogs versus cats, which is one of my favorite explanations. Is one of the big behavioral things is dogs seem to rely on and acknowledge us more than cats do. Sorry to cat people out there, but it's a stereotype. But one of the explanations is domestication of dogs was about bringing wolves and then dogs into our lives in a way that they would help us get food and then rely on us to be fed. Cats we were bringing into our lives to eat the pests, eat the rats, eat the mice, so they were their own source of food. They weren't being domesticated to be reliant on us for food in the way that dogs are. So,
and here we have it where we get them like keto, gluten-free, kosher for Passover kibble or something, and they're dependent on us because they've evolved enzymes that make it impossible for them to digest what wolves would do at this point. They would die from protein toxicity. So yeah, it's interesting.
And that is it for episode 20. As always, keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Cher Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.